Go ahead,
Thank
Jessica.
you, Mark, and thanks to Mr. Smith for his years of leadership on the Judiciary Committee and Immigration Subcommittee. Yes, as Mark said, the president and his allies have launched another campaign for comprehensive immigration reform, of which a massive amnesty covering as many people, as many illegal residents as possible, is the centerpiece. And the goal is the same, but this time the proponents of comprehensive immigration reform are trying out some new arguments. The last time, 5 years ago, one of the primary arguments put forward for comprehensive immigration reform was, we can't possibly deport 12 million illegal residents. It can't be done. Well, that was a false construct. Therefore, we need to have comprehensive immigration reform and a massive amnesty. Well, that was a false construct back then, and our work over the years since then often has been focused on demonstrating how it is possible to control immigration, illegal immigration. And that argument ultimately was not convincing at the time. Now it seems that the proponents have abandoned the we can't possibly deport 12 million people and seem to be saying, well, we already are deporting many, many people from the country. We've built this, what's been called a formidable machinery and an impressive bulwark against illegal migration. Therefore, in fact, we may have even gone a little bit overboard in what we've done in enforcement, and therefore now is the time to enact comprehensive immigration reform and amnesty. The reality is quite the opposite. We have built some good systems to control immigration, but this is hardly the formidable machinery or foundation that is necessary before we can put any kind of legalization program in place. In fact, I would submit that far from a bulwark, what we really have is the largest executive amnesty that has ever been put into place by any administration at this time. And what we need to do before, understanding that, it becomes clear that really what's necessary for us is that if we are going to even discuss a legalization program, it's critical that we lay the foundation for a system of enforcement and also a system of processing legal immigrants and anyone who would be legalized that has control and integrity. And those are the two elements that are now lacking, control and integrity. Why? Because in addition to all the fiscal and, costs and labor market distortions that result from an amnesty program, one of the most enduring lessons of past amnesties is that they inevitably beget more illegal immigration. And there are indications already that DACA has done just that. But before I describe this foundation that needs to be in place of control and integrity, I know some of you are out there saying, but wait a minute, hasn't this administration deported more people than ever before? Deportations are running at what are called record high levels. And so let me explain my assertion that we have the largest amnesty in place now. First of all, the DACA program itself is a huge program. We have 300,000 some people who are in the pipeline now, but there is no real end date to this program. So we have no idea how many people are ultimately going to benefit from that program. In addition, there are some other small administrative amnesties that have been implemented that I won't spend a lot of time on here. But also, as the president himself has said, the deportation numbers are, quote unquote, a little deceptive because they include large numbers of people who were apprehended by the Border Patrol, not by ICE, not in the interior of the country where most of the burden of illegal immigration is borne by the communities that we live in. ICE doesn't actually publish the deportation numbers so that you can see exactly how these apprehensions came about. But others, including Mr. Smith, have noted that they do include numbers of people that were never counted before, like people caught at the border, people given voluntary return who weren't actually removed. And so a large share of what's called this formidable machinery is actually immigration that's kind of happening at the edges of the system, either at the border or within from the criminal justice system. Definitely not at the workplace, for example. Workplace enforcement, of course, is an essential element to an effective immigration law enforcement system. And finally, we also have now in place policies that are called prosecutorial discretion that severely limit the ability of immigration enforcement agents and officers in exercising their authority and in carrying out the requirements of the law, which is that people that they encounter who are here illegally are subject to removal. Right now, what ICE is pursuing is a policy that it calls, they go after the worst of the worst. And that not only does it leave a lot of the worst offenders here, living here without fear of deportation, everybody else is exempt from the possibility of enforcement as well. So what would be an effective foundation for to get in place before we could start a conversation on a legalization program? One of the handouts in your packets is a chart in which I wanted to set up and highlight the differences between the elements of an effective enforcement program and the current situation. And it's pretty detailed. I know our communications team, when I handed that in as a handout for this event, were looking at me going, "Are you kidding? This is really long and detailed." But to summarize, it's basically, we know it is boring and detailed, and the reason it's boring is because we already know what has to be in place to enforce the immigration laws. Operational control of the border. The latest GAO report, which the Government Accountability Office, which does a great job of measuring in an objective way how effective our enforcement really is, has said we're at about 61%, catching about 61% of people who are trying to enter illegally. We need better control of legal entries also at the ports of entry. For example, we need a system that verifies that the people who are using some of the 9 million or so border crossing cards are actually the people to whom that card was issued. We don't check that now. Most people are kind of surprised to hear that. But that's essential. That's an essential part of this foundation of control and integrity. We need to keep track of who's leaving because somewhere between 30 and 50% of people living here illegally came on legal visas and have overstayed them. We need a universal workplace compliance and enforcement system that uses the tools like E-Verify and Social Security monitoring together with actual workplace enforcement. So again, these are not new ideas. That we know what has to happen. We simply haven't had the political will to actually implement these programs that we know will work. And there's ample evidence both at the federal level and the state and local level that these programs really work. So in addition to having a foundation of control and integrity on the enforcement side, we need to have these qualities also present in our legal admission system. Again, whether it's going to be for people coming in on temporary visas, on green cards or immigrant visas, but also any program of legalization. And there are two parts to that. The first has to do with fraud. And you can see by the poster over here that past amnesties have legalized huge numbers of fraudulent applicants, people who did not qualify and who perpetrated fraud to get the benefit. We know that our legal immigration system is riddled with fraud. Unfortunately, USCIS, the agency that's responsible for administering most of these benefits, does not publish the results of the studies that it does to determine the level of fraud within these programs. But we know from experts and from anecdotal information that it's huge. Some people have estimated that the marriage visa program, for example, which is the largest one we have, brings in something like 400,000 immigrants each year, has perhaps a 25% fraud rate within it. We've convened a group of experts, people with experts in the field, to assess the state of our fraud prevention efforts within our legal programs, and we're going to be coming up with some recommendations that are critical for policymakers to consider. But I think we all know that fraud is a huge problem that has to be addressed, and without the controls, potentially millions of people will benefit from future programs without these controls in place. The other mechanism that helps control not only the fraud, but just dealing with people who may not have committed fraud, but they simply don't qualify for the categories that we have set up and for the categories of people that we've decided to accept. This is another critical, and you would think would be a given in any legal system, but is something that is absent from our system today. People who don't qualify are not put on the path to removal in most cases. They're simply allowed to stay here. And that was a glaring problem with IRCA, as David will discuss, but also in DACA too, which has some of the same provisions that make that possible. One example of that is known as the confidentiality provision. Under this provision, which was a part of IRCA and is also a part of DACA, and the language has been put in, for example, the Bush-Kennedy amnesty plan from 2007, is that the information on a benefits application can only be used to determine whether someone will get the benefit. In other words, in adjudicating that application. Not only will individuals who don't qualify or who commit fraud not get the benefit, but under the current system, they will not be referred for prosecution, nor will they be referred for removal. We obviously don't have the resources to prosecute the massive numbers of fraud cases, but we can impose the consequence of removal, which is what should happen, and we're not doing even that. This is a legal loophole, the confidentiality provision, that really destroys the integrity of the program because people are allowed to stay here even though they didn't qualify for the benefit. And so the absence of mechanisms to reduce fraud and remove unqualified applicants really has to be a deal breaker in any discussion of a legalization program. And I think we need to watch in the coming debate what happens, and you'll be able to see if the proponents of legalization programs can't accept even these most basic forms of control and integrity in the process, then they really aren't serious about making sure that we have control and integrity in the system and are not really looking for a compromise, but simply a massive general amnesty. So those are, that's one of the key elements that, as I said, you can watch to determine how serious people are. So I'm going to stop there and turn it over to John and to David to talk more about DACA and more about IRCA and what we can tell from those programs to inform the debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica.